Welcome to Schools Out. I'm Lisa Watson. It's official. School choice is winning. Check this out. Lawmakers in 42 states introduced school choice bills, and 14 states passed school choice legislation. 6 of those states will have universal or near universal access to private schools within 3 years. Congratulations to the parents in Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Utah. No doubt about it, COVID overreach did more to expand school choice than skyrocketing property tax bills, failing test scores, and teacher sex scandals combined. Thanks, COVIDiots. The hypocrisy of government school shutdowns while private schools remained open smacked of elitism and an outrageous double standard. Parents who assumed the schoolhouse was solely dedicated to reading, writing, and arithmetic suddenly found out that little Bobby and darling Susie's impressionable minds were being saturated with some very grown-up ideas. Subjects like drag queen story hour, gender queer theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory, socialism, Marxism, and the idea that America is an inherently racist nation were pouring out across the Zoom screens. The same teachers they met during kindergarten roundup were now on a covert mission to undermine their parental authority and groom their children into all manner of alphabet soup agendas. Conservative legislators started responding by saying, "Parents, take the wheel." Liberal legislators, not so much. In fact, 100% of the states that have enacted school choice legislation have been conservative. All across America, parents were demanding answers at school board meetings. And some found themselves arrested and labeled domestic terrorists. The left had awakened a sleeping giant, and her name is Mama Bear. And just like that, Mama Bear started running for school board. Today, I'm going to sit down with a local Mama Bear and walk through her awakening to the fact that her idyllic suburban school district was saturated with pornographic books that were in reach of the elementary school students. And imagine her shock when she found out that the Marxist agenda she was fighting during the COVID years had been fully exposed to Congress in the 1960s. Let's get into it. Today, I'm sitting down with a new friend, Kristin Grubbs. Kristin is one of the mama bears I told you about and the author of an amazing blueprint for any parent that needs a step-by-step guide to defeat the woke mind virus that may have taken over their school district. What's up, Kristin? Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, Kristin, welcome to the show. Before we get started, can you quickly give me some of your background and explain how you got involved in the school choice movement?
Sure. So I am a wife of 22 years, a mother of 4 kids in a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. And I grew up there. My husband spent 10 years in the Navy. And when he got out, we came back to raise our kids here. And in the last few years, through COVID stuff, I started seeing some not okay behavior by the school district. And so we decided in February of 22 to pull our kids. And so we've been homeschooling since. And so that kind of what I found in my research led me to advocating, shall I say, for school choice. So I know more now that it's up to, what kids need, not necessarily what the state tells them they need, but parents need to dig in and see what each individual kid needs in their education and how they learn, and then find the best possible method.
Okay, Kristin, I'm going to jump right into the controversy. You wrote a book called The Deep End of Public Education. And I'm going to get straight to the chapter 14. And it's titled, What is Going On in School Libraries? It seemed like much of your journey revolved around what you found is to be a high level of pornographic materials in your school district's libraries. Tell me a little bit about what you found.
Well, the first time I learned about this issue was actually in December of 2021. I had started going to school board meetings just to be more aware of what was going on in the school district. I'd never actually attended one before.
Mm-hmm.
And then in December, so I was in August, I started going. And by November, my eyes seemed kind of open. That November meeting, they discussed some things that were very concerning to me. And I had learned by December that there was a book that was under review at the board level, which means it had already been through a committee to be reviewed. And the board had decided that December to retain the book. And they said there was nothing wrong with it. It was the book called All Boys Aren't Blue. And I spoke at that December meeting for the first time at a school board meeting. It was nerve-wracking, but about Missouri's laws on what's pornographic for minors and how this book crossed that line. And yet the board, of course, retained the book. So it was my first experience speaking before the board, especially speaking on such a topic that I never even knew existed in my district. And then I ended up over the last, actually in 2023, I spoke several times on this issue. As that January of just this last year, I filed complaints about some books. And I know we'll talk about that in a moment, I'm sure. But yeah, I found books that have content that I, even as a wife of 22 years, would never read. Like, it's inappropriate. It's extremely graphic, let alone putting it in a school library. Just seems, I know it's optional for them to read, but making it available to them is just wrong. It's just wrong.
Well, one of the things that I try to bring to this conversation is the understanding of how we create social movements and use the movement to impact the culture. So you and how you came into the conversation from, believing that your school district was completely normal. They were focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic, and you would have never challenged anything, or even you had never even been to a school board meeting. And I know now parents like you and the movement is creating activists. An activist class is important to any social movement. So tell me about how many books did you guys identify, and what are some of the hoops you guys have to go through to get a book removed?
Okay, so I started digging late in 2022 into these books because I kept hearing it in the news elsewhere, and I thought, oh gosh, no, not here. But I had already learned about other stuff going on in our district, and I thought, why not here? So I started looking into the school libraries. Thankfully, I have access online. You should have access online to what's in your school libraries. And I immediately found, I can't say immediately, but I found 89 different titles, including All Boys Aren't Blue would be 90 titles. But it had just been reviewed, so it could not be reviewed again that soon. And so I, as well as 5 other community members, filed complaints. Over 180 complaints were submitted, and it's 1 complaint per title. So I submitted 89 of them, and of the 89, 8 of them were removed, but not because of the content. It had to do with low circulation rate, things like that. And then the other 81, the book review committees were formed. 28 different committees were formed of 5 or more people. And it took them from February until May, June time period to complete all those reviews. And I appealed, of course, all of the books. The 81 were retained by committee. And so I appealed 61 of those. And what that means is when a book is reviewed and retained by a committee, which is made up of parents and students, even with parental consent, teachers, administrators, once they review and make a decision on a book, if the complainant does not like the decision, they can appeal it, and it goes to the board level, which means then that the school board has to review the book. Well, I appealed 61 of them, which I knew to be quite an obstacle for the school board because they don't want to have to review 1 or 2, let alone 61. How would they have time? And so I knew it meant that they would have to face the problem that exists. It's a bigger issue. You have to face it differently. How are these books getting in that we now have 61 that need to be reviewed, right? So they decided by majority vote, we do have 3 conservative-leaning school board members on our 7-member board, but they decided by majority to approve 41 of those and send them straight on through. And so we ended up with 61, 4 were remaining. Mm-hmm. They decided to send the rest of them through. We're not even going to look at them, not individually review, but 4 of them they set aside. And the only reason they set them aside is because on those particular committees, one person said, maybe we should have restrictions on this book. And so the board thought, well, if one person on the committee, and it was only one person on each of those committees, thought maybe there should be some sort of restriction, not that the book is wrong, but that maybe there should be like an age level restriction, then maybe we should go ahead and look at these. And so that's the only reason those 4 books were set aside, not because of me or any other parents that had conflicts with them, but because these 4 committee people had conflicts. And so they did 1 book per month. And so it took them until September to finish reviewing those 4 books individually. But by majority, all 4 books were retained. So none of the books were removed of the 89. None were removed because of the sexual content.
Okay, so parents who are listening, mama bears or this activist class that we have to build up to have a successful movement. Uh-huh. If you're listening, the book Kristin wrote, The Deep End of Public Education, she actually gives you the step-by-step guide for what you need to do in order to, go through this process, because you didn't have a guide helping you. You were figuring this out all on your own.
Yes.
Right.
It was a process. I mean, I asked questions to those around me who, I met one of the parents who had filed a complaint on the previous book, and I asked questions. But yeah, it was a lot of, learning how to do this and how do we submit complaints on 89 different titles. And I have found more titles since then, but haven't filed complaints because I wanted to make sure that process was complete on the other ones first.
Well, that's sort of the goal. As I said, I came out of the left. One of the roles that I played was I was a union steward. So unions are masters at writing contracts and writing walls. So if people can't penetrate them, they get demoralized and they sort of give up. You didn't give up.
No.
And you figured it out, and then you wrote it down for others so they'll be able to learn from what you did.
Yes.
So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in your book. I'm going to go to chapter 17.
Yes.
This chapter is titled, Where Did All This Come From? And in this chapter, you jumped in the Wayback Machine and you found a plan from 1963. Mm-hmm. And this plan was actually read into the congressional record by a Democrat, Senator A.S. Herlong from Florida. Can you summarize what you found?
Well, up to the point before I found this information, I had been learning more about wokeism kind of stuff. I kept hearing all these terms, so just being inquisitive, I looked into it, and it led me to socialism and Marxism, communism efforts back in the 60s, even before that. And so, yes, I stumbled upon the 45 communist goals, current communist goals in 1963. And of those, reading through them, I was quite alarmed that I used 18 of them in my book because they all relate in one way or another to education. And I discuss how they relate to education and examples of how these have either come to fruition already or are in the process of coming to fruition. And it's quite alarming to see that these are goals that were set well before 1963.
Right.
They just happened to be recorded in Congress in 1963. And it's hard to read them and not see education differently. You know what I mean?
So they see education a certain way.
Yes.
As
And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a few of them so people have an idea what I'm talking about. Just
go for it.
real quick, kind of flip through here. There's certain ones that, I mean, especially to the book issue, they relate immediately to that. Number 24 says, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Number 25 says, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. And 26 says, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as natural, normal, and healthy.
So
has that not come to fruition already? Exactly.
So goals that are at least 50, 60 years old.
Now, mind you, 40, 56 years ago, this was not happening. I mean, not to this degree. And now we have books that are blatant pornography that are being accepted by school board members all across the nation. And you go, how is this happening? What has trained them to think that this is okay for children?
And that's the challenge that we're up against. How do we get parents, people that agree with us, the church, to say or see that even though something is presented 50 years in advance and no one seems to be able to figure out a way to make a move to reverse course. And that's what movements are designed to do, to shift the culture, then shift the politics. So we are at a point in the show that I like to call school choice in the news. So how it works is I'm going to show you a video clip, and that reflects on the state of school choice and the school choice movement. For the audience that may be listening and not watching, let me set this clip up. The scene is a school board meeting in Dearborn, Michigan. This is a community that is 40% Muslim, and the heading for the video is Christians and Muslims Unite to Fight Sexually Explicit Material in School Libraries. This clip is about a minute. Let's take a look.
The Washington Post reported that Muslims and Christians are teaming up in Michigan to protest the creepy LGBT curricula in the schools. So the way the Washington Post reports it is that the Christians are the bad guys and the Muslims were just kind of duped and brought along for the ride. If you look at the videos, by the way, it looks like the Muslims here are actually leading the show, and Muslims are obviously very, very represented because of mass migration in Michigan and in Dearborn in particular. They show up to a Dearborn Public Schools meeting and they chant that they want to throw the bums out because these weirdos in the schools are trying to trans the kids and push the rainbow ideology on them. Take a listen.
Vote them out! 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 Vote them out!
Vote them out. Now, as far as I can tell, every single person in that room is a Muslim. I don't see anyone that looks particularly Christian there at all. But the Washington Post has to frame it. They can't frame it as the Muslims are the bad guys. It always has to be the Christians who are the bad guys, or the white people who are the bad guys, or the men who are the bad guys, or the straight people who are the bad guys. That's the way that their identity politics works.
Okay, so based on what you've been doing, what do you think of this clip?
I think it's quite fascinating. It really shows that the issue is bigger than just, white Christians, shouting off at the mouth. There's an overall, value that people have for life and protection of the young. We see it in nature too, with animals. And yet here are humans wanting to protect their young. It's not a religious thing necessarily. It spans religions. It spans different cultures. We want to protect our young. So when we see something that's harmful, we want to pull them in close and then, hold off the bad. And I think that's exactly what was happening there and what's happening in communities all over.
This speaks to the power of the school choice movement. It's transcendent. It's not about being a Christian conservative. It's about caring about children, whether you have children or not. Most people care about children and they want to protect children. So this movement, this is just we have natural allies in this movement. Okay.
Absolutely.
So now, when I was doing research to learn a little bit about you and reviewing your book, I actually found a review of your book. And It was so powerful that I wanted to read it to you, okay? So the heading is, "This book could change your child's life." And it says, in the deep end of public education, Kristin Grubbs has written a carefully researched yet chilling book about what is happening in her school district in a suburb of East Kansas City. If you think this isn't happening in your school, you're deluded. Grubbs discusses the panorama surveys containing emotionally and racially leading questions and how they're administered several times annually to children in elementary and high school. Surveys do not require parental permission, and student data is not anonymous. The data is stored not within the school district. It's stored at Amazon Web Services, a company known for data mining and censoring conservatives. Deep End discusses the public fact that this survey company was co-founded by Attorney General Merrick Garland's son-in-law, who, with the assistance of Garland, contracted with 23,000 public schools and raised $76 million from investors. That's who has our children's records. Talks about how you provide a comprehensive exposure of the efforts taken in your school district to indoctrinate children, school professionals, and parents into diversity, equity, inclusion, wokeism, and transgenderism. They tell a little bit about how much money was being spent on these programs, and you cover that in depth in your book. But this review told me that your book changed this person's life. So how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel great. That's the whole goal. Is when I was doing all my research, I realized there's not enough support out there for families that want to look in their own communities. And people need to know. I was content in my school district. I grew up there, K through 12. I went to community college in the same community. And it's like I never knew anything was wrong. My kids I had at least one kid in the public school system there for 10 years until I pulled them. And I thought, oh, it's a great school district until I knew it wasn't. And so I think most people are under this veil of, oh, everything's fine, it's all good. That wouldn't happen here. And so with my book, my goal was, I could have included this school district, that school district all over the country, but then it dilutes what's actually happening in mine. And I thought if I share all of what's happening in one suburban school district in the middle of the country, it's kind of shocking. You might go, oh, if all that's happening in that one district, then maybe it's happening in mine. And that was my goal, is to make people think, make them wonder, and make them want to look into their school district. So yeah, this is encouraging. That's my goal, is to get people to want to do their own research.
Okay. Well, you did more than just your own research. You did research, you ended up writing a book, and you ended up making a decision about how you were going to educate your children. So what was that decision?
Well, we're homeschooling now. I pulled them in February of 2022. My husband and I decided, after all these COVID measures that just did not add up, and after the equity conversations they were having that did not add up, nothing, something stinks, so you just go, something's not right. And when I started learning about the surveys, I thought, if they're willing to hide this, what else are they hiding?
Right.
They're not telling me something. So we pulled them. And so we've been homeschooling since. And actually this school year, my oldest of my four, I have a 13-year-old in 7th grade. I've got twin 11-year-olds in 6th grade. And then I have a 16-year-old who we homeschooled last year with her. But this year she's actually with Liberty University Online Academy for her 11th grade year. And she's taking dual credit for college as well. So they're all getting their own education in the way that hopefully works best for them. I still, homeschool parents, they always say, hey, you got to show yourself grace. It's a learning process. And it is. There's some growing pains. But I'm definitely seeing some wins since we started homeschooling individually in each of my kids. And so it's been life-changing in so many different ways. But the more I learn, and I do continue my research, and I do continue to speak out, and I do plan on writing more on these issues to help other parents. But I did tell my kids, don't plan on going back, because I don't know, it would have to change a complete 180 turnaround before we even consider sending you back. But I'm loving what's going on at home. It's a work in progress, but I'm loving the changes. So we don't plan on going back.
So if we have people listening or watching and they're on the fence about homeschooling, what would you say to help them make the decision?
Well, as Chris and Kristin Grubbs would say, take the leap. Seriously. Because it's scary. It's absolutely scary. I mean, I've had it in my heart for years. My husband and I discussed whether we would homeschool because something God laid on my heart. It was just something I've yearned for, even since my oldest started kindergarten. And
Thought about it?
It's always been something because growing up, I wanted to be a mom. I wanted to be and I told my husband before we even got married, I said, just so you know, when we get married, we start having kids, I'm going to be a stay-at-home mom because my mom stayed home with me until I was in kindergarten and able we didn't homeschool, but and she didn't go to work outside the home until I was in school. So she spent time with me and I loved that. I mean, I was the youngest of four, so I loved that one-on-one time with my mom. And so I wanted to make sure I provided that for my kids. And now it's a whole different deal because we're home all the time. I'm legit with my kids all the time. But it's just something that I feel like I was meant to do. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't know the extent of it. And I didn't know what route would make me make that decision.
Right.
And when it was kind of one of those when it got bad enough. And I hate to say it, but that's really how it was. It got bad enough. And so we finally made that decision. And I wouldn't change it. So I would tell them, you can sit down and you can outline everything. You can do the pros and cons, but there are advantages and there are wins that you can't predict.
Right.
You can't predict them. You won't see them coming. And yeah, there are some struggles that are in there, but you know what? You'll get to know your kids more and you'll get to know yourself more and you'll learn just as much as they learn in the process. So it's absolutely worth it.
Well, after chatting with your daughter and her saying that there's nothing that she misses about the public schools, then that's a great aid for you, okay? So I hate that the time goes by so quickly. Thanks a million for joining me and helping educate everyone on what's going on in the public schools, what's going on behind the scenes in the local school districts. I know that everyone listening is intrigued. They want to know how to contact you and how to get this book.
Absolutely.
They want to learn more. What would they do?
Absolutely. Well, they can find me on Facebook at Deep End of Public Education. You can find me on other social media platforms. Most of my documentation and records and videos and stuff I share on my Facebook page, though. And you can even find links to the other social media on there. You can find a link to my podcast, also titled Deep End of Public Education.
I listened to some of that. Be specific. Where do they find that?
I was going to say, I started hosting it through Anchor, which is now owned by Spotify. So you can find it on Amazon. If you go to Amazon, do a search for Deep End of Public Education, you will find my podcast. You will not find my book unless you narrow it down to just books. This is a little hoop that Amazon has put me through. I've had conversations with their customer service people, and they say it's because I marked my book as being for adults. And I did that because of chapter 14, because I do quote some passages from All Boys Aren't Blue. And so I don't believe children should be reading my book. And so I put it as adult content, and they said, well, you won't find adult books under a general search on Amazon. And I tested that out, and I searched up titles that are explicitly adult material, like Kama Sutra, things like that we all know is adult material, and you will find a multitude of results immediately without narrowing the search. So I'm feeling a bit filtered and a bit buried by Amazon. But yeah, you can go to my Facebook page, and I have under my information on there links to most of this stuff. So a direct link to my book on Amazon. You can find a link to my podcast and other social media as well. So it's a pretty good source.
Okay, perfect. Okay, guys, this is a wrap for this week, but please meditate on what role you can play in building out the school choice movement, because the fate of America will not be determined in the White House. It will be determined in the schoolhouse. If you want to learn more about building a school choice movement, I'm going to post new content every week, so don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.